Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to preview Wolves Celtics on Friday night. Boston's reeling somewhat. The Wolves need to come in and play well to beat one of the league's best teams. We'll preview that matchup, specifically what's been going on with the Celts. Plus, I want to look at Naz Reid and some lineups he maybe could be successful in moving forward as Rudy Gobert is now back on the floor for the Wolves. And we'll also close with a look at power rankings league-wide, where the Wolves sit in a wouldn't call it a rough and tumble Western Conference. We'll call it a jumbled Western Conference. So upcoming on the show, welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. Happy Friday, everybody. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Like I said, happy Friday, happy Christmas weekend. If you are celebrating Christmas this weekend, happy holiday season, and happy game day. The Wolves are in Boston to take on the mighty Celtics. Although the Celtics have been, falling on a bit of hard times here lately. We'll talk about that in a moment. Plenty to get to on the show here today. First of all, though, a big thank you for making Locked on Wolves your first listen every day. Locked on Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, from Apple to Google to Spotify, Odyssey, wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find Locked on Wolves and all the Locked on programs. You can also download the Locked on Sports Minnesota app on either Roku or Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7 for free. Download the Locked on Sports Minnesota app today on either Roku or Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow this show on Twitter at Locked on T-Wolves and also at Beecken. And that's with two B's, two E's, CKEN. All right, I want to start today with the preview because I think the Celtics matchup is really interesting. And Boston, this is kind of if you're a Timberwolves fan, which you probably are if you're listening to this, and you follow the team closely, this feels like one of those games that the Wolves could come out and be like, all right, we'll be okay. We won 3 in a row. We lost Wednesday, but we played okay against a pretty good team in Dallas. And this is a tough road trip, Christmas weekend, whatever. We'll come out. We'll just kind of go through the motions and we'll be okay in this one. And Boston, they're playing the Boston Celtics at Boston. Boston is not a team to be trifled with, if you will. Obviously, right? They had easily the league's best record coming into the week. They've struggled a bit of late. And to me, that's a recipe. The Wolves coming off a reasonable loss Wednesday, right? A game that they were in. Now going to Boston to take on a team that's lost 5 of 6. 5 of 6 losses for Boston. And yet their record is still 22-10. So before this losing streak, they were 21-5. Now they've lost 5 of 6. They still have the second best record in the entire NBA. They're only a half game behind the Milwaukee Bucks, who are 22-9. So losing 5 of 6, still the second best record in the league, in a virtual tie for first in the Eastern Conference and the best record in the NBA. So this is a team that's really, really good. They're relatively healthy. They have Robert Williams, the third back. He's a huge part of what they do, especially defensively. And he had missed the entire season up until the last week. He's played in 3 games now to this point. And at some point, he's going to get reintegrated, get up to speed. He's going to really shore up their defense. Sitting here right now, coming into this game, Boston has the number 1 offense in the league in terms of offensive efficiency, offensive rating at Basketball Reference. And they're 9th in defensive efficiency. That's going to improve with Robert Williams III on the floor. The other kind of top flight defender on that team, Marcus Smart, is questionable on Friday with an illness. So not sure at this point, obviously, if he's going to play or not. But this is a team that's going to hit its stride defensively, is surely mad that they've dropped 5 of 6, 2 of which have come against the Orlando Magic. They scored just 92 points in a loss to the Magic earlier this week. They were down by as many as 30 against the Pacers at home in Boston on Wednesday. They've now lost 3 straight home games, twice against Orlando, 1 against the Pacers. Of course, teams they should be beating easily. And they were actually getting booed down 30 on Wednesday at TD Garden and, came back, made it respectable. They ended up only losing by 5. But Orlando's 12-21. They're one of the worst 6 or 7 teams in the entire league, 5 or 6 teams in the league. The Pacers are better than expected, but they're a 500 team. Boston has no business, relatively healthy Boston, losing these games. they're going to come out ready to play against a Wolves team that you better believe they're licking their chops. They're saying this is our opportunity to get right. How many teams have gotten right against the Wolves, right? Now the Wolves took advantage of a reeling Bulls team on Sunday, a reeling Mavericks team on Monday. Dallas pushed back Wednesday, and now the Wolves are taking on a reeling Celtics team. The difference, though, is that the Bulls have kind of been reeling all season. The Mavs haven't played up to stuff all season. The Celtics were the best team in the league until a week ago, and they still are arguably the best team in the league, regardless of their losing 5 of 6 and 3 in a row. I mean, they've got a better point differential than every single team in the Western Conference. Better than Memphis, better than the Pelicans, much better than Denver. Like, this is a really, really good team. Jason Tatum's unbelievable. And everything Boston does revolves around Jason Tatum. Not in a different way, but it's not all too dissimilar from the Luka effect with Dallas, right? And he doesn't play the exact same way. He's a better long-range shooter, certainly, than Luka. Percentage-wise, only a little bit better, but he shoots even more threes than Luka. It's a big part of what he does. The Celtics as a team are 3rd in the league in three-point attempt rate and 6th in percentage. So they shoot a lot of threes and they make a lot of threes. The Wolves, in terms of opponent three-point percentage, are 26th in the league. That the Wolves actually allow the most made three-pointers per game of any team in the league. They allow more than 14 made threes on average, 14.3 made threes per game. They allow the second most attempts, and they have the 5th worst defensive field goal or defensive three-point percentage, They allow opponents to shoot 37.4%. So opponents shoot better than the individual league average on threes against the Wolves. And they're taking on a Boston Celtics team that is 3rd in three-point rate, 6th in percentage, 2nd in makes per game. So the Wolves give up, 14 a game. The Celtics make 16 a game on average. So this is not a good matchup for the Wolves in terms of outside shooting. And Boston has all their shooters available, right? They've got, Al Horford in terms of volume doesn't shoot a ton, but he's 44% for three. Grant Williams, 43.5%. In terms of Sam Hauser off the bench for them, 42% for three. Derek White, Jason Tatum, all these guys are league average or better in terms of percentage. And then they've got a bunch of guys kind of right under league average. Like Marcus Smart has continued to improve his shot. He's now a 34% three-point shooter. Again, not super high volume. That's not his game. But he can make threes. Basically, everyone on the Celtics team takes and makes threes, and the Wolves have to deal with that, despite having a really bad three-point defense. So we saw this breakdown late in the Mavericks game on Wednesday. We talked about it extensively on Thursday's show. Is that Luka was making the right reads late in that game, right? He's initiating from the top of the key. The Wolves are trying to send high wall coverage, dedicate 2 guys to stopping the ball with Luka Doncic, which they need to do, right? But then he's making the right read, kicking to the slot, and then they swing to the corner, or he's hitting the roller, who's then hitting the opposite corner. And the Mavs got, they made 5 consecutive threes down the stretch in the fourth quarter, went from a 3-point Wolves lead to a ultimately was part of I think it was a 15-4 run or something like that. It was 15-4 because it was 5 made threes. And Tim Hardaway Jr. and Spencer Dinwiddie, these guys just got these open threes and knocked them down against the Wolves. Now, the difference is the Celtics have much better complementary players than Dallas Mavericks. I love Dinwiddie. I think Tim Hardaway's good. But the Celtics have a roster that fits together and makes more sense to me than Dallas's roster. And I'll take Jason Tatum. I'll put him up against Luka Doncic every day of the week. I think Jason Tatum's fantastic. But in my opinion, having, Jaylen Brown, obviously in terms of volume, is a dangerous scorer. He's not the shooter that Tatum or even Doncic is. And I don't think he's all around nearly as good of a player, but he's a pretty good, 1B or pretty good second option, right? Marcus Smart, like I mentioned, has developed into a pretty good complementary offensive player. And I haven't even mentioned Malcolm Brogdon, who coming off the bench for them after having the career he did in Milwaukee. He's now 30 years old. He's a 45% shooter for them off the bench. And he's 3rd in terms of scoring per game with the Celtics. These role players fit Boston much better than Dallas has fit Dallas. And that's obviously not the only difference between a team that's 22-10 and a team that's 500. But it's similar to Dallas in that it's Tatum centric, just like they're Luka centric, but the other pieces are far more dangerous. The Wolves played with fire. They altered their scheme. They played more high wall than they did, and switched a little bit more than they would typically do on Monday without Rudy Gobert too, by the way. Didn't play drop coverage. It worked. They got to win. Dallas couldn't make the threes that they needed to make to win on Monday. On Wednesday, Dallas made threes down the stretch. They didn't for most of the game, but finally they made open threes. The Wolves were half step late in rotation, and that was all she wrote. You don't have that same margin for error against the Boston Celtics. Now, I know they've lost 5 of 6, and we have to factor that in. But this is a team that is ultra dangerous and not a very good matchup for the Wolves because they're such a good three-point shooting team. They shoot so many threes. They can play fast or they can play slow. They can kind of dictate terms however they want. They don't commit a lot of fouls. They're solid defensively. They're a good rebounding team, especially defensively. And they're going to limit Wolves' second chance opportunities. They don't really turn the ball over. It's a disciplined, well-coached team, well-put-together team. It's, to me, a scary game for the Wolves. They have to come out ready to play. And then if they get a lead and are fortunate enough to be in the game at halftime, they can't have those same third quarter issues we've seen the Wolves have so often this year. But it's a matchup that worries me for the Wolves, even though that Boston's lost 5 of 6. Now, a win in Boston would really make things feel like the sky is falling for the Celtics. And for the Wolves would be a huge way to get off, a hugely positive way to start this 4-game Christmas road trip, Miami on Monday, and then New Orleans. It just gets more difficult than Milwaukee. So a win would be massive for the Wolves, but this is going to be a really difficult matchup for Minnesota. All right, next I want to talk two-man lineups. I want to talk about Naz Reid's potential role moving forward and some of the advanced metrics around what Naz has done to this point. Now that his role has expanded a little bit, Rudy's back, still no cat. I think it's an interesting conversation. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at the NHTSA. Did you know that driving high is considered driving under the influence? That's right. Driving under the influence of marijuana is against the law in every state, even in states where marijuana is legal. That means driving high could get you a DUI. And if you think law enforcement officers can't tell when you're driving high, you're wrong. Your friends could tell, your coworkers could tell, even your parents could tell. Everyone can tell. So what makes you think that law enforcement officers don't know when you're driving high? Driving under the influence of marijuana can slow your response time and change how you perceive time and speed. So even if you think you're fine to drive when you're high, you're not. Because the bottom line is if you feel different, you drive different. And driving high is driving under the influence. So remember, drive high, get a DUI. Paid for by the NHTSA. Thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today, the biggest stories around the sports world in 20 minutes or less, plus instant reactions, game recaps, and Locked On's take of the day. Locked On Sports Today, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. All right, so Naz Reid obviously played extremely well when both Rudy and Karl-Anthony Towns were out here basically over the weekend, dating back to, I guess, late last week. You look at his game log, and of course, he had the one game in there where he only played 12 minutes because he left with the injury, but he had 28 and 9, made 3 threes, was 61% from the floor against the Thunder last Friday, only played the first quarter and a little bit of the second, 12 minutes total against the Bulls in the win on Sunday, and had 10 points, scored the first 10 points of the game for the Wolves in that game. Perfect 4-4 shooting, made a couple threes, comes back, plays Monday against Dallas, 27 and 13, shoots 57% from the floor. So 3 consecutive games shooting 58% or greater, making at least 2 threes per game. On Wednesday, Rudy comes back. So Naz only plays 13 minutes, has 6 points, 4 assists, 3 rebounds in 13 minutes, and makes both of his 3-point attempts. We're seeing his 3-point percentage increase. For the month of December, he's shooting 48% from outside the arc. Naz Reid is. So we're seeing him play better with more minutes. That's perhaps not surprising. It shouldn't be. Now for the season, Naz is shooting 38% from 3. He's averaging effectively 10 and 4 plus 1 assist per game and only 16 and a half minutes per game. He only has the 3 starts total, and they all occurred over last week here. And we saw his minutes go from basically 40 a game with no Rudy to 13 a game with Rudy, and yet he still played well in those minutes. The Wolves, of course, lost, and this is part of a conversation I'm not prepared to have yet, because I'm not about to argue the Wolves are better without Rudy Gobert. I think Rudy Gobert up to speed, comfortable, etc., will make the Wolves a much better team. I don't think there's any question about that. But there's also no question that Naz Reid played better Monday and played better going back to Friday in Oklahoma City than Rudy Gobert played overall Wednesday. And yes, I know Rudy had the numbers. He shot 9 of 11. He had a double-double at halftime, but he had a quiet second half. The Wolves weren't able to get him the ball against a small Mavericks team. Now, that's not entirely on Rudy. That's also partly on the Wolves guard play, and that has been consistent in terms of entry passes. I feel like the Wolves have been not that Rudy's posting up, but going back to Jeff Teague couldn't throw inbounds, entry passes to Karl-Anthony Towns in the post, a few years ago. Taj Gibson, he just couldn't. And now we've got guys who can't throw lobs or can't, which is a little more complicated than throwing an entry pass, but can't throw lobs or can't hit rollers. Like they're struggling with getting the ball to Rudy in advantageous positions. And early in the season, they were forcing it to the Wolves' detriment for the most part. And now they're kind of not even trying at times. And they've got to find that balance, right? There's been a couple games where we've seen that chemistry between D'Lo and Rudy, or even at times between Ant and Rudy. Certainly saw it with Towns and Rudy before the cat injury. But they're not finding that consistent way to get Rudy involved. So Nas has played so well because of the chemistry he's had with some of the guys that are running the backcourt for the Wolves. Jalen Noel, Nas and D'Lo have actually had pretty good chemistry. So what's the solution to getting Nas more involved, right? You're not really realistically going to play him much over Rudy Gobert. They only played 2 or 3 minutes together the other night on the floor together. So far this season, they've only played, what have they played? 87 minutes together, Rudy and Nas, which is like kind of middle of the pack in terms of two-man pairings. I mean, they've had basically 50 two-man pairings that have played more often than Rudy and Nas together. So 87 minutes together. They're a negative 13.8 in terms of net rating. Not great, I guess. I don't really know what else to say about that. It's actually, in terms of pairings that have played together, the only ones that are worse so far this season for the Wolves that have actually played together a decent amount. Forbes and Noel together played 80 minutes, and that's been worse. There's a couple of other ones in there. Rivers and Kyle Anderson, weirdly enough, are a minus 17.3. Naz and Wendell Moore are a minus 14.8 and 50-ish minutes together. But then Nas and Rudy are basically like, if you take lineups that have actually played together for 50 minutes or more, two-man lineups, Nas and Rudy are like the 5th worst two-man lineup together, a minus 13.8 net rating. And I think it's probably just a familiarity thing as much as anything. And also we've seen throughout Nas's career, still relatively brief career with a brief number of opportunities, he plays much better as the center than he does as a four in basically every lineup. And we saw the Rudy and Cat pairing have some complications. Again, not as much due to those two players as to guards figuring out how to play with them. And I think with Rudy, Naz sees himself more as like, okay, I'll hang out on the perimeter and I can be a stretch big, but he's also a good passer. Naz can also put the ball on the floor and score. I've said all along in Naz's career, he's basically like a light version of Karl-Anthony Towns offensively. I still think that's true. He maybe naturally is a little bit of a better ball handler and not nearly as good of a shooter. And maybe naturally is a little bit of a better passer. I think Towns at this point is probably every bit as good, but it's interesting that now we're seeing the possibility, right, of moving Cat move to the 4 for Rudy to be at the 5. Why not try Nas at the 4 more frequently? Again, I just gave the numbers. They're not good. But against a team like Boston, like, hey, we're not going to beat them going small. Like, let's just try and play big and put Nas at the 4 and see what we could do. Like, Boston's not going to trot out, bigs that are going to beat the Wolves down low, right? They're a good rebounding team. Nas has rebounded the ball much better this season than he ever has in his career. Let's try Nas at the 4 more often. Rudy at the 5, play big. Now, the problem, of course, is defensively, right? It's going to help you rebounding the ball. I think they can do it offensively. We saw Towns and Rudy have a decent chemistry themselves. I think Nas on the perimeter is fine. I think that can work. The question is, how does that work defensively? And that of course, was the biggest question mark with Towns and Rudy together anyway. And Nas, pound for pound, I think is a worse defender than Karl-Anthony Towns. Yes, he's more nimble. He's more mobile. But I think Towns has better feel defensively. And I think Nas could be a better shot blocker, in the paint, off ball, coming from the weak side, be a better shot blocker than Cat. But on the ball, Cat's a better defensive player than Nas. So the big question is, how will that work? Can Boston hunt those mismatches like, for instance, Dallas did with Luka? I think the answer is yes. But I also think this is a game the Wolves are unlikely to win anyway. Like, you're probably not going to beat them with Jaden McDaniels at the 4. And Boston's still going to hunt the matchups they want, right? The Wolves still have enough weak links defensively. And the hope is Rudy can fill your back line and cover you in the paint. But Boston's, again, in a lot of ways, a much better version of Dallas. So I don't know that it's necessarily going to work. All I'm saying is I think the Wolves should try it, right? Throw something against the wall, see if it sticks. If nothing else, you're getting a guy who's been one of your better players on the floor in Naz Reid. He's been a top 30 center, according to ESPN's real plus minus, which, again, we're a third of the way through the season, roughly, a little more than a third for most teams now. So, they're not, end-all, be-all numbers, but currently, Naz Reid is 29th in overall real plus minus among centers in the league. Rudy's 4th behind Jokic, Embiid, and Porzingis. Towns, incidentally, is 15th. Of course, now he's only played 21 games compared to most of these guys have played upper 20s, 30-plus games. But Naz offensively has been one of the better centers in the league. He's a 1.75 according to offensive real plus minus, which puts him actually 7th in offensive real plus minus. Towns is ahead of him. Towns is 3rd. Jokic, Embiid, Towns, Porzingis, Thomas Bryant with the Lakers, Gorgie Jang, both limited players, not playing a ton minutes per game, so throw them out. So Naz is really 5th if you put him behind Jokic, Embiid, Towns, and Porzingis. So the eye test, that's backed up by the real plus minus here on ESPN, which I guess if you're not familiar, it's my favorite advanced metric that actually it's my favorite box score metric that tries to account for teammates that are on and off the floor with you. And I think it does a pretty good job. I think like a lot of stats, it sometimes can overinflate bigs. But if you look at bigs versus bigs, then obviously that, I think it becomes more useful as a tool. And Naz has been one of the best offensive centers in the league. The question is, can he guard defensively? Can he do what you need him to do? Can Rudy cover up his issues? Can the Wolves find a way to get Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards and Austin Rivers guarding the perimeter players you want them to be guarding? Or can the Celtics hunt the Naz matchup or the D'Lo matchup? That's the biggest thing. But all that to say, I think Naz should play more minutes with Rudy. Now's the time to try and figure this out, right? Because if that's not going to work, they need to consider what happens next with Naz, right? He's an expiring contract, a very small, reasonable contract. He's going to get paid in the offseason. Now's the time to see, is this going to work? Could we play Naz with Rudy moving forward? If, say, this is a whole other conversation, and I've never said this before, but I don't know, maybe if you consider trading Karl-Anthony Towns in the future, could Naz do enough offensively and Rudy do enough defensively? Could Naz be a better fit with Rudy? Sitting here right now, the data tells us no, but it's a small sample size. I think it's worth testing those waters here over the next several games when Towns is still a few weeks from coming back. And I should also be clear, a big reason for that is because Naz played so well in the absence of Rudy Gobert, and he just continues to show when given those minutes offensively, he's a starting caliber center. It's the defensive things that need to get cleaned up. Can you cover for some of that by having him on the floor with Rudy and Jaden McDaniels, for instance, as a lighter version of Karl-Anthony Towns? All right. Next, I want to talk about power rankings, where the Wolves sit in a jumbled Western Conference. We're going to do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from pro football to college bowl season to basketball and World Cup. They've got it all at betonline.net. Of course, the World Cup just ending, but now we're into college bowl season, and we're into, I guess, I don't know, you get college bowl season plus football, basically 4 days a week now, Monday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday. Yeah, 4 days a week of NFL football. Last part of the regular season, of course, the Vikings battling for playoff position, college basketball season on top of the NBA. There's plenty going on at BetOnline. If you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline. They're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. Head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, let's close this thing out by talking power rankings. We haven't checked in a couple weeks. The Wolves, at the beginning of the week, were a game above 500. Well, I guess I should say after winning Monday, they were a game above 500. So ESPN did their power rankings and bumped the Wolves from 21 to 19. So 19th in ESPN's power rankings feels about right to me. Maybe a notch or two higher, perhaps. Over at NBA.com, which I love John Schumann's power rankings at NBA.com. They're very thorough. He did his at the very beginning of the week, actually even before Sunday's win. Or no, wait. I guess this would have been before Monday's win, after Sunday's win, before Monday. So when they were 15-15, they're 16-16 now. So same record. He had the Wolves as just so he says in his write-up about the Wolves, they're a tick worse than league average offensively and a tick worse than league average defensively, and talks about how it hasn't been a straight line. Like they had the miserable performance against the Clippers last week offensively. They scored 88 points. And then against the Bulls, they scored 150 points. The most points ever in a Timberwolves game, ever in franchise history. The second highest effective field goal percentage in a game in NBA history. An effective field goal percentage of 78.7%, which of course takes into account the weight of a 3-point shot over a 2-point shot. So Schumann goes on to talk about how they're 2-0 without Towns or Gobert. This was before the win Sunday, or excuse me, before the win Monday. So actually they're now 3-0 with no Towns and no Gobert. They're 1-3 in the second game of back-to-backs, but then they won Monday. So now they're 2-3 in the second game of back-to-backs. And then he talks about how the stretch starting tonight, Friday against Boston, is the start of a 4-game road trip and a stretch with 11 of 14 games against teams that are currently over 500. And I've talked about this for a while. This road trip, Boston, Miami, New Orleans, Milwaukee, is an absolute murderer's row of teams the Wolves will not be favored to beat or even really sniff beating. I'm excited to see the Pelicans. I think that'll be a fun matchup, but a scary matchup for Minnesota. We'll talk more about that next week. But a really tough stretch coming up for the Wolves. And, I think putting them in the late teens, around 20 in terms of overall league power rankings makes a lot of sense. If you look at the Western Conference as a whole, the Wolves still sit 10th at 500, but they're also only 4 games out of first place in the West. And they're 6.5 games out of last place in the West. You have 13 teams are within 6.5 games of first place in the Western Conference, which is crazy. We're talking more than a third of the way through the season now. The Spurs and the Rockets are really the only teams that don't have a hope of making the playoffs. And, both have been kind of, doing what we expected them to do. The Thunder have been better than expected. By the way, they're on a 3-game win streak sitting here right now. They've now passed the Lakers in the West. Golden State is 11th. Golden State's a game and a half behind the Wolves. Everybody expects them to right the ship. In fact, I believe they're still the favorites to win the Western Conference, which is nuts because they're in 11th place. But they're only 5.5 back of first because it's been such a jumbled mess, in the West. The Sacramento Kings are number 6 in the Western Conference. The Wolves are only 2 games behind the Kings. Kings are just 4 games above 500, and Minnesota hasn't even seen Sacramento yet. So I will say that the 9 teams ahead of the Wolves all have positive point differentials. The Wolves are negative 0.6 with a 500 record. But every team below the Wolves has a worse point differential than them. So point differential is obviously an indicator, or is often an indicator, I should say, of future success. What happens next? Where could we project from here? And what that tells us is that the Grizzlies, Pelicans, and Suns are probably the best 3 teams in the West. Denver's probably not as good as their record. And then Sacramento's maybe outperformed their record a little bit. The Wolves are kind of right where they should be based on their performance so far. But you got to believe I think Portland's going to get a little worse. I think ultimately Utah still gets a little worse. I don't think they're actually, right now they're 3 games above 500. They've righted the ship a bit. I think Sacramento will get a little worse. I think New Orleans is probably still a top 5 team in the West, but I don't know that they're going to finish in second or third. So I think when this thing shuffles a bit, the Warriors will improve. The Portland will drop. Utah will drop. I think maybe the Lakers kind of sneak in around the 10 spot. But it's tough for me to see. My preseason projection was the Wolves would be in 4th, 5th, or 6th at the end of the season. It feels now like 6th, 7th, 8th feels about more right for the Wolves. Of course, the ceiling is much higher because they have 2 top 20 players, probably 3 top 50 players, depending on what you think of Ant, but potentially even better if he figures things out. D'Lo playing like he did, I guess the last 2 Mavs games haven't been great, but before that, he'd been fantastic over his last several games. So the ceiling is still there for the Wolves to finish much greater than 7th or 8th in the Western Conference. Getting out of the play-in would obviously, I said at the beginning of the year, basically the year is a failure if the Wolves end up in the play-in. I still believe that to be true. But at this point, getting in the play-in, it would be so much better than not getting to the play-in at all, right? So to the Wolves, this works to the Wolves' benefit that the West is such a mess right now. One hot streak, which, by the way, isn't going to happen. It's just not. With 11 of 14 against teams over 500, no Karl-Anthony Towns, banged up Rudy Gobert, Kyle Anderson's questionable again Friday in Boston. I didn't mention that earlier. With the injuries they have and the schedule they have, I don't see the Wolves going on the streak yet. But if things can stay jumbled in the West, and the Wolves can, when they play New Orleans, when they play Sacramento, these teams they haven't seen yet, if they can win a couple of those to help them in the standings in the West and also improve tiebreaker odds, we could be, again, all it takes is that hot streak. And maybe it doesn't happen until mid-late January when Towns comes back. But all it takes is that one hot streak in today's Western Conference to really end up in a sunnier spot in the West. All right, that's all we have for you today. We will do the live postcast tonight after the game with Marnie. The plan is to go live about 45 minutes after the tip, 6:30 Central. So we will go live. And then on Monday, we'll have a show. Day after Christmas, we'll preview the matchup Monday night between the Wolves and the Heat. We'll talk about anything else, cleaning up, revisiting Friday night's game as well. So have a fantastic weekend. A big thank you to those of you that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Reminder, you can listen anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can watch on YouTube. You can watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku or Amazon Fire TV. Of course, the Locked On Minnesota podcast, Locked On Wolves podcast is available, like I said, anywhere. It's also part of the Locked On Wolves, part of the Locked On NBA network. The Locked On Network is your local experts on the biggest stories. Of course, for your second listen, you can listen to the Locked On Sports Today show. Peter Bukowski brings you the biggest stories from around the sports world in 20 minutes. Get the analysis and opinions before anyone else with our local and national experts and insiders. The Locked On Sports Today podcast is available on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.